If this kind of storytelling is your style, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps our stories coming.
The dress was perfect. Hand-stitched Chantilly lace, ivory white, $28,000 worth of thread and dream, and 6 months of secret savings from a woman who hadn't been allowed to make her own decisions in 5 years. Emilia Santos had chosen it alone, bought it alone, hidden the receipt in a lockbox her fiancé didn't know existed. And that was exactly what made Brandon Hale furious. She was standing in the bridal suite of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral in Nolita, Manhattan, adjusting the lace along her collarbone when she heard the footsteps, hard, fast, the kind of walk that belongs to a man who's already decided he's going to ruin something before he opens the door. Brandon came in looking like every woman's dream, black Tom Ford suit, hair slicked back, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, but his eyes were cold, the kind of cold Emilia had learned to read over 5 years of silence and small cruelties. Her 2 bridesmaids, Monique Torres and Yara Osei, froze by the door. Her mother, Regina Santos, 54 years old, lupus eating her joints, 2 jobs breaking her back, stood by the window, clutching a bouquet of white peonies with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since she'd arrived in Manhattan for the first time in 2 years. Because Brandon had told Emilia that the Bronx was too dangerous for weekend visits. That her mother's neighborhood wasn't the kind of place his wife should be seen. Everyone in that room felt the air change. "You're wearing that?" Brandon said. And it wasn't a question, it was a verdict wrapped in a voice she'd heard 1,000 times before. The same voice that told her she laughed too loud at dinner parties, that opinions were too much for his colleagues, that her Spanish was embarrassing when she spoke it in public. Always too much of something, never enough of something else. "It's my dress," Emilia said, keeping her voice steady even though her hands were trembling behind the folds of lace. "I chose it. I paid for it." "With what money?" Brandon stepped closer, circling her like she was evidence in a case he'd already won. "Who paid for this, Emilia?" "Because I know what you make, which is nothing, and this dress costs more than your mother's apartment." That's when she saw it, the thing behind his eyes that wasn't just control. It was fear, the fear of a man who realizes the woman he's been shrinking for 5 years still has a part of herself he can't reach. He grabbed the shoulder of the dress. Emilia heard the sound before she felt it, the lace tearing, fibers separating, 6 months of secret hope ripping apart from shoulder to waist. And then Brandon said the thing she'd never forgive. "You're just like your father, always pretending to be more than you are." And look how that ended for him. The bouquet slipped from Regina's hands. White peonies hit marble like a muffled scream. Monique lunged forward, but Yara grabbed her arm. And Emilia stood perfectly still, staring at her reflection in the mirror, at the torn dress, at the bruise on her wrist she'd been hiding under a bracelet for 2 weeks. At the woman she used to be, the 21-year-old who'd translated $200 million contracts in 3 languages, who'd corrected senior lawyers twice her age without flinching, who'd once sat across from one of the most powerful men in New York and told him his clause was wrong, and something inside her, something that had been asleep for 5 years, opened its eyes. "No," she said, and if you think that word was the end of her story, you don't know what happened next. Because 20 minutes later, the doors of that church swung open, and a man walked in who made every person in those pews hold their breath. A man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and feared in back rooms. A man who hadn't set foot in a church in 20 years, but drove across Manhattan in 12 minutes, because he saw a live stream of a woman in a torn dress, and recognized the fire in her eyes from 6 years ago. His name was Rain Volkov. And what he did next changed everything. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button so I know you're here, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to that bridal suite, to the exact moment Emilia Santos looked in the mirror, touched the torn lace, and decided she was done being small. Emilia looked at the tear in the mirror for 3 more seconds, then turned her back on the glass. She didn't adjust the dress, didn't pull the fabric closed, didn't do a single thing Brandon expected her to do. She walked toward the door, Brandon stood blocking the wooden frame, both hands braced against either side like a wall, and his voice dropped lower, into that tone he always used when he wanted her to obey, without having to shout. Think about what you're doing, Amelia. There are 250 people sitting out there. My parents, my partners, my boss. You walk out like that and you're not just embarrassing yourself, you're destroying everything we've built. Amelia stopped one step away from him. She looked straight into those cold eyes. The eyes she had once believed were calm, dependable, a place of refuge. And for the first time in 5 years, she saw them exactly for what they were. Empty. Good, she said, and her voice didn't shake. Let them see. Brandon blinked. Only once. But it was enough for Amelia to know he hadn't expected that answer. He was used to her lowering her head, to her saying okay and going to change, to her swallowing it down and smiling in front of the guests as if everything was fine. But today wasn't that day. Behind Amelia, a small sound broke the air, the scrape of a chair across the stone floor. Regina Santos rose to her feet. She stood slowly because her knees hurt, because lupus had been eating away at her joints for 15 years, because these legs had stood for 12 hours a day in 2 jobs, to raise 2 children after her husband was shot to death in a robbery in South Bronx. But she stood. She walked to her daughter's side, took Amelia's hand, and spoke loudly enough for Brandon to hear every word, loudly enough for Monique and Yara to hear, loudly enough for herself to hear the strength in her own voice after 40 years of silence. Your father didn't live to walk you down this aisle, but I'm here, and I won't let anyone do this to you again. Her hand trembled, but her grip was firm. Amelia could feel every knuckle of her mother's hand tightening around hers, could feel the weight of those words, because Regina Santos had never spoken a single sentence against Brandon in all 5 of those years. It wasn't because she hadn't wanted to. It was because Brandon had cut off every path that would let her come near her daughter, and she had been afraid that if she spoke, Amelia would lose even the little contact she still had left. But today, standing in that dressing room thick with the scent of peonies and expensive perfume, looking at the dress her daughter wore torn open by the hand of the man who was supposed to love her, Regina decided that silence was no longer the way she would protect her child. Monique Torres stepped forward and stood behind Amelia, both fists clenched at her sides, her eyes fixed on Brandon without blinking. Yara Osei stood beside Monique, quieter, but with her shoulders straight and her chin lifted. 4 women facing 1 man in a doorway. Brandon looked at them, looked at Amelia, looked at Regina, looked at Monique and Yara, and for the first time he understood that he was no longer dealing with a woman who stood alone. He stepped aside, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what to do when 4 women moved toward him at once, with eyes that weren't asking permission. Amelia opened the dressing room door. The corridor of the old church stretched before her, long, hushed, and bright with candlelight. She stepped out without looking back. Amelia stepped out of the side corridor and turned into the main aisle of the church. The moment she appeared at the head of the aisle, the elderly organist in the loft looked down, and his fingers stopped in the middle of a note. The wedding march died in the air, cut off as abruptly as if someone had pulled the plug, and the silence that crashed down over St. Patrick's old cathedral felt heavier than any music. 250 heads began to turn. The first row turned first, where Petra Hale in a pale blue Valentino gown and Douglas Hale in a gray 3-piece suit sat with the posture of people accustomed to controlling every room they entered. Petra was the first to see the tear. Her mouth opened, then closed again without a sound. Douglas narrowed his eyes as if he were trying to process a contract with the wrong clause in it. Then the second row turned, then the third, then the fourth, like a line of dominoes falling backward from the altar to the door. The right side of the church was full. That was Brandon's world. Douglas's fellow attorneys, investment fund managers in gray suits and expensive watches, Petra's art gallery friends wrapped in silk scarves and French perfume, business partners Brandon needed to impress, the entire perfect arrangement for a perfect wedding that was now watching the bride walk forward in a dress torn from shoulder to waist. The left side was almost empty. A few of Amelia's former co-workers from the law firm sat scattered there, one college friend, two aunts from the Bronx whom Brandon had reluctantly allowed to be invited, and in the last row, almost hidden behind a stone pillar, Tommy Santos sat with his face drained of color, his phone still in his hand with the message he had sent his sister 20 minutes earlier, a message about $40,000 in new debt he had no idea how to repay. A message Amelia hadn't had time to read before Brandon stormed into the dressing room. Tommy looked at his sister walking in that torn dress, and he lowered his head because, even without knowing what had just happened in the dressing room, he knew that somehow her suffering had something to do with the burdens he kept piling onto her shoulders. Amelia walked slowly. Not because she hesitated, but because she wanted to feel every step across the cold marble floor through the soles of her shoes. You wanted to hear the soft drag of the dress along the ground. You wanted to look straight into the eyes of all 250 people staring at her without lowering her head. Regina walked beside her, still holding her daughter's hand, her back straighter than Amelia had ever seen it. Monique and Yara followed behind them, two figures in lavender bridesmaid dresses, moving with the steady rhythm of an escort. The whispering began, soft at first, like wind slipping through a crack in a door, then louder. Someone in the 5th row whispered, "What happened to the dress?" And the person beside them answered with a shake of the head. A woman in the 3rd row lifted her hand to her mouth. A man in a navy suit in the 5th row pulled out his phone, raised it, and started recording. Then another phone appeared. Then another, like fireflies blinking awake one by one in the darkness of the church. Someone in the 7th row started a live stream. And from that moment on, Amelia Santos's story no longer belonged only to the 250 people inside the church, but began to belong to the whole world outside. Amelia had made it halfway down the aisle when she heard the sharp strike of leather shoes against the stone floor from the left side aisle of the church. Brandon didn't come through the main aisle. He ran around through the side corridor along the row of stone columns, trying to get to her without crossing in front of the 250 people holding up their cameras, but by the time he burst out from between the pews and grabbed Amelia's wrist, every lens had already turned toward them. Amelia felt those familiar fingers clamp around her wrist, right over the old bruise, in exactly the way he always held her. Not hard enough to be called violence, but tight enough that she knew he wasn't asking what she wanted. He was giving an order. "Amelia, stop. You're making a scene. Just come back to the room and we'll figure this out like adults." But before Amelia could react, Monique Torres stepped forward. Monique didn't shout, didn't make noise. She simply placed her hand on Brandon's wrist and peeled his fingers away from Amelia's hand one by one, with the cold calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Touch her again," Monique said, her voice low enough that only Brandon and the nearest rows could hear it. "And every phone in here has it on camera." Brandon pulled his hand back as if he'd touched something hot. He looked around and for the first time realized that at least 30 phones were pointed at him, those small, dark glass eyes recording every movement, every expression, every word. He stepped back half a step but didn't leave, still standing there with his eyes moving quickly between Amelia and the crowd like an animal cornered and calculating its way out. Amelia stopped. She had walked about 20 meters from the head of the aisle, and there were 20 more meters left before the altar. She turned, not toward Brandon, but toward everyone, toward the 250 faces looking at her with every kind of emotion, from shock to curiosity to pity to judgment. And she spoke. She didn't shout. Her voice rose naturally through the old stone church, because churches like this were built to carry a human voice, and Amelia Santos's voice in that moment was steady enough to reach the very last row. 5 years, she said. For 5 years, this man controlled every dollar I spent. He checked my bank statements. He questioned every purchase. He told me I didn't need to work because he'd take care of me. And then he used that against me every single day, reminding me that I earned nothing, that I was nothing without him. The silence in the church now was no longer the silence of surprise, but the silence of people holding their breath. For 2 years, Amelia went on, and her voice began to tremble slightly but didn't break. He kept me from visiting my own mother. 2 years. My mother lives 40 minutes away by subway, and he convinced me that her neighborhood was too dangerous, that going back there meant I was going backward. 2 years my mother spent alone with her illness while I sat in a penthouse pretending everything was fine. Regina, standing behind her daughter, used her free hand to wipe away tears but didn't let go of Amelia's hand with the other. He made me quit the best job I ever had, Amelia said, because he said it was embarrassing that his fiancée worked for another man. He made me stop speaking Spanish in public because he said it made people uncomfortable. He told me my laugh was too loud, my opinions too strong, my dreams too big. Everything about me was always too much for him. She looked straight at Brandon. He stood a few steps away, his face drained white beneath the candlelight, his eyes darting all around the church, searching for someone who would take his side. But no one stood, no one spoke. His father, Douglas Hale, sat in the front row with his jaw clenched tight, and his mother, Petra, was crying, though it wasn't clear whether from shame or shock. "I was going to marry you today," Amelia said to Brandon, and her voice now carried something heavier than anger. It was grief for 5 years she would never get back. "I was going to stand at that altar and say yes because I'd forgotten what it felt like to say no, but you just reminded me." She was about to say more. She was about to say there would be no wedding today, that she was ending everything, that he would never touch her again. But she didn't get the chance, because at that exact moment, at the far end of the church, the 2 heavy oak doors of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral flew open with a crash that thundered through the vaulted ceiling, and the midday sunlight poured into the aisle like a flood of light, and in the middle of that brightness, a figure appeared, standing still, tall, unhurried, as though the whole world could wait a few more seconds for him. 20 minutes before that moment, on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, Rain Volkov was seated at the head of a long black walnut conference table with 14 men in expensive suits, waiting for him to sign a real estate deal worth $300 million. Kostya Petrov, Rain's bodyguard and right hand, stood in the corner of the conference room as he always did, his back against the wall, his eyes sweeping the room, his phone in hand as he scrolled through the news with the habit of a former operative who never stopped watching. Kostya passed over a live stream that was spreading fast across social media, a video from inside a church, a bride in a torn dress walking down the aisle, and he recognized her instantly. He walked over to Rain, lowered the phone for him to see without saying a word, because Kostya knew that with Rain Volkov, an image said more than any explanation ever could. Rain looked at the screen. The video shook slightly, the angle coming from the 7th or 8th row, but the young woman's face was clear enough for Rain to recognize the eyes he had last seen 6 years earlier in a glass conference room in this very building, the eyes of the 21-year-old interpreter who had dared to interrupt him in the middle of a meeting to say that Clause 7.3 in the Italian contract contained a serious translation error, and that if he signed it, he would lose his right to sue. Rain watched the video for 15 more seconds. He saw the tear in the dress. He saw that the young woman wasn't crying. Her eyes were burning. He stood up in the middle of the chief counsel's unfinished sentence. All 14 men fell silent at once, because when Rain Volkov stood without warning, no one in the room dared continue speaking. Rain didn't explain. He looked at Kostya and said 3 words. "Get the car." Kostya vanished from the room. Rain followed, leaving behind 14 men, $300 million on the table, and an unsigned pen. The black Mercedes Maybach S680 was waiting in the garage, Kostya driving, Rain in the back, and the car cut across Manhattan from Midtown to Nolita in 12 minutes, a stretch of time that anyone who lived in New York knew was impossible at midday, unless the man behind the wheel was Kostya Petrov, and the man in the back seat was Rain Volkov. And now he stood at the doors of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. The noon sunlight poured from behind him, casting a sharp black silhouette across the old stone floor. He stepped inside. The perfectly tailored gray 3-piece Tom Ford suit followed the lines of his tall frame. Black Oxford shoes polished enough to catch the candlelight, the faint scar running along the left side of his jaw left uncovered, as always, because that scar was a map of his childhood in Brighton Beach, and he wasn't ashamed of anything that had made him who he was. The Patek Philippe on his left wrist flashing each time his arm moved with the rhythm of his stride. He wasn't in a hurry. Every step was measured, deliberate. The sound of leather on the 200-year-old stone floor, echoing with the steady rhythm of a clock counting down. Kostya remained outside the church doors, both arms crossed over his chest, his back to the street, his eyes scanning the sidewalk on Mulberry Street, standing guard as if this weren't a church at all but a meeting room of national importance. Inside, 250 people were watching Rain Volkov walk in, and no one understood what was happening. But all of them understood one thing. The man who had just stepped through those doors wasn't a guest. Rain walked down the main aisle of the church, without changing his pace. Not faster, not slower, each step falling the same distance apart, as if he were walking through the corridor of his own building, rather than between 250 strangers with cameras pointed at him. He didn't look to the left. He didn't look to the right. His eyes stayed fixed on the far end of the aisle where Amelia stood in her torn dress with 4 women beside her. And the way he looked at her, only at her, as if no one else existed in that space, made the entire church understand that he had come for one person, and one person only. The whispering began to spread from the middle of the church. A man in the 4th row, an investment fund partner seated on the Hale side, leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "That's Volkov," in the kind of voice people use when speaking the name of something that shouldn't be spoken aloud. The man beside him went rigid. The name traveled from the 4th row to the 5th, from the 5th to the 6th. And every time it reached someone new, the reaction was the same. Backs straightening, shoulders tightening, the instinctive reaction of a body realizing that what had just entered the room was more dangerous than anything they had prepared themselves to face. This wasn't admiration. When a movie star walked into a room, people turned with eager eyes, wanting to get close enough to touch. When Rain Volkov walked into a room, people turned with something far older and more primitive than that. The instinct of a small animal when a larger predator stepped into the mouth of the cave. In the front row, Douglas Hale recognized Rain the moment he crossed the threshold. Douglas had been a lawyer in Manhattan for 40 years. He knew the name Volkov. He knew which buildings belonged to that family. He knew the rumors about where their money had come from before it was washed clean through real estate and restaurant chains. And now he was watching the owner of that name walk through his son's wedding. His hand found Petra's and gripped it tightly. Petra turned to her husband with wide, panicked eyes and whispered, "Douglas, who is that?" But Douglas didn't answer, because the answer wasn't something he wanted to say out loud in a church. Brandon stood in the middle of the aisle, a few steps from Amelia, still trying to find some way to control the situation. And when Rain passed him, what happened was worse than any punch or threat could have been. Rain didn't look at him. He didn't turn his head, didn't glance sideways, didn't slow his stride, didn't change his breathing, didn't acknowledge Brandon Hale's existence with even the smallest gesture. He walked past Brandon the way a man walks past an empty chair by the aisle, the way he walks past air, the way he walks past nothing. And Brandon felt it. He felt the emptiness of being completely unacknowledged by a man the entire room was afraid of. He was used to being hated, used to anger, used to resistance, because all of those emotions gave him power. All of them confirmed that he mattered enough to provoke a reaction. But Rain Volkov's total indifference told Brandon something simpler and crueler than any words ever could. He wasn't worth noticing. Rain stopped in front of Amelia. The distance between them was less than a single step, and from that close Amelia could see every detail of this man's face. The steel gray eyes cold as iron but not hollow like Brandon's. The faint scar running from beneath his left ear along the line of his jaw like a stroke of ink someone had forgotten to erase, and the way he looked down at her torn dress. He looked at the tear. His gaze moved slowly, carefully, along the line of fabric ripped from shoulder to waist, like a man reading a sentence before passing judgment. His jaw tightened. That was the only sign of the anger inside him. No clenched fists, No widened eyes, no sign at all of losing control. Only that hard set of his jaw, until the scar pulled slightly taut, and anyone who had ever worked for Rain Volkov would have known that this was when he was most dangerous. Not when he raised his voice, but when he was silent and his jaw locked tight. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if she was all right, didn't ask who had done this, didn't say a single word, because words in that moment would have been unnecessary. Instead, he lifted both hands to the collar of his gray Tom Ford suit, unfastened each button slowly, slid the jacket from his shoulders, and draped it over Amelia's. The gesture was so gentle that Amelia barely felt the weight of the jacket until it was already resting across her shoulders, covering the tear from shoulder to waist, covering the ripped lace and the strip of skin exposed beneath it. The warmth of his body still lingered in the fabric, and Amelia felt it spread from her shoulder down her arm, along with the scent of sandalwood and leather. Not the overpowering smell of strong cologne the way Brandon wore it, not the cheap sting of drugstore cologne, but something deeper, quieter, like the man standing in front of her. And the moment that warmth spread across her shoulders, the memory came back with a clarity so sharp it felt as if it had happened yesterday. 6 years earlier, a glass conference room on the 42nd floor, 15 attorneys seated around the table. She had been the youngest interpreter in the room, and she had interrupted the man at the head of the table to say that clause 7.3 in the Italian version contained a serious error. 15 attorneys had stopped breathing. Some had looked at her with anger, some with worry for her. But the man at the head of the table, the man with the scar along his left jaw and those cold gray eyes, hadn't been angry. He had looked at her for 3 seconds, then nodded once and told the room, "Fix it." It was the only time Amelia Santos had ever seen a powerful man who didn't feel threatened by her intelligence, but recognized it. And now that same man was standing in front of her in this church, having just placed his suit jacket over her shoulders without asking permission. But this wasn't Brandon's kind of not asking permission. Brandon tore things off her. This man placed something over her shoulders. For the first time in 5 years, someone had put something on Amelia's shoulders instead of ripping it away, and the difference between those two actions was so simple that it nearly made her cry right there where she stood. Rain turned toward Brandon. He took 2 steps closer. Only 2. But those 2 steps were enough to make Brandon step back once on instinct, and the entire church saw it. Saw the groom retreat before a man whose name he didn't even know. Rain didn't touch Brandon, didn't raise a hand, didn't lean toward him. He simply stood there looking down at him with those cold gray eyes and spoke, softly, slowly, each word falling like a stone into still water. "You had something extraordinary, and you broke it because you were too small to appreciate it." Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound came out, because Rain Volkov's voice wasn't the kind of voice people interrupted. It carried the weight of a man who was used to being heard, and not used to being cut off. Rain let the words hang in the air for a few seconds more, then turned to the 250 guests. He didn't step onto the altar platform, didn't need a microphone. His voice carried naturally through the old stone space the same way it carried in conference rooms, in closed offices, in any room he entered. "My name is Rain Volkov," he said, "and I need you to understand something about this woman." He didn't point at Amelia. He didn't have to, because every eye had been moving between him and her from the moment he walked in. 6 years ago, Amelia Santos walked into a conference room in my building. She was 21 years old. She was there to translate documents for a $200 million real estate acquisition, contracts in English, Italian, and Spanish. And she was the youngest person in a room full of lawyers who'd been practicing law longer than she'd been alive. He paused. The silence in the church had become so dense it felt like something pressing against the skin. Halfway through the meeting, she stopped the entire room to tell me that clause 7.3 in the Italian version had a critical translation error. She told me to my face, in front of 15 of my own lawyers, that if I signed that contract, I'd lose the right to litigate. She was right. That one correction saved my company from a lawsuit that would have cost me everything. He let his gaze pass over the 250 faces. That woman, that brilliant, fearless, extraordinary woman, was made to believe by this man, and this was the first time he acknowledged Brandon's existence, pressing the words, "this man," with the tone people use for something stuck beneath the sole of a shoe, that she was nothing. Then Rain went on, and his voice changed. It was no longer the voice of a man telling a story. It was the voice of a man delivering a sentence. But since we're all here sharing truths today, let me share one more. He looked straight at Brandon. Your fiancé owes $800,000 to a fund that launders money for people whose names you don't want to know. He's been borrowing against a reputation he doesn't deserve for 18 months. He needed this wedding. Needed her standing beside him looking respectable, because his creditors were watching. This wasn't a marriage. It was a business arrangement, and she was the collateral. The church erupted in whispers. Not soft whispers anymore, but the sound of 250 people trying at once to process something no one had been prepared to hear. Brandon stood in the middle of the aisle with a face as white as paper, his mouth opening and closing, his eyes darting everywhere, searching for a way out. But the aisle ahead of him was blocked by Rain. The aisle behind him was full of cameras, and on both sides stood 250 people who now knew the greatest secret of his life. In the front row, Petra Hale broke into tears. Not tears for her son, but tears because she had just understood that the wedding she had spent 6 months arranging, choosing every flower, every napkin, every piece of music, had all been nothing more than a shell wrapped around the debt her son had hidden. Douglas Hale rose to his feet, 40 years of lawyer's instinct, making him react before he could think. Now listen here. You can't just walk into a private ceremony and make accusations without... He didn't finish. Rain turned his head and looked at him. Just looked. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, didn't lift an eyebrow. He simply looked at him with those cold gray eyes, and the patience of a man willing to let Douglas finish the sentence, only so he could understand that it wouldn't change a thing. Douglas Hale, a lawyer of 40 years in Manhattan, a man who had faced judges and federal prosecutors without flinching, sat back down. And in the silence that followed, when no one spoke, when Brandon stood trembling in the aisle, when Petra was crying, when Douglas stared down at his own hands, Amelia Santos raised her voice. It wasn't loud, but in that silence it rang like a bell. There is no wedding. 5 words. Not a question, not a request, not an apology. It was the final judgment of a woman who for 5 years had not been allowed to decide anything, and this was the first decision she had made for herself. Amelia's 5 words were still hanging in the air of the church when Rain turned back to her. He didn't touch her, didn't place a hand on her back, didn't make any gesture that suggested possession. He simply held out his right hand, palm up, and said 2 words, "Come with me." Amelia looked at that hand. It was a large hand, long-fingered, and she could see the calluses across the knuckles. Not the calluses of a man who played golf or held a pen, but the calluses of someone who had used his hands for things she didn't know and probably shouldn't ask about. She knew that taking this hand wasn't like taking Brandon's hand 5 years earlier, on their first date at a restaurant on the Upper East Side. Taking this hand meant stepping into another world. A world of glossy black Mercedes Maybachs, and a bodyguard standing watch outside the church door, of a name that had made a lawyer, with 40 years of experience, sit down in the middle of his own sentence, of money and power and shadows she didn't fully understand. But she also knew that this hand had just placed a jacket over her shoulders, while the other hand had torn her dress open. So she took it. Rain's hand closed around hers, firm but not crushing, holding but not trapping. And that difference was so small it was almost invisible. Yet Amelia felt it more clearly than anything she had felt in the past 5 years. They began to walk toward the church doors. Regina followed immediately behind them, her hands clasped across her chest, her eyes wet but her back straight. Monique and Yara stayed close behind, and after they had taken only a few steps, the first applause broke out. It came from the 7th row on the left, from a woman around 60 years old whom Amelia didn't know, one of the aunts from the Bronx whom Brandon had reluctantly allowed to be invited, and the woman rose to her feet and clapped with tears in her eyes. Then another person stood in the 5th row, one of Amelia's former co-workers from the law firm. Then another, from the 9th row. Then the 10th, women rising one by one like candles being lit in the dark. Not everyone. The Hale family remained seated like statues of stone. Petra still crying, Douglas staring straight ahead with the look of a man calculating legal damage, Brandon's friends and business associates sitting frozen in their seats, afraid to move because they had just learned that the groom owed $800,000 to dangerous people, and no one wanted any part of that. But enough people stood, especially women. Women who watched Amelia walking away in a torn dress with a man's suit jacket over her shoulders, and saw in that image something they recognized, something familiar, something they too had perhaps endured once, but had never found the courage to stand up before 250 people and say no to. Amelia reached the church doors. The noon sunlight poured in from outside, and when she stood at the threshold, where the darkness of the church met the brightness of the Manhattan street, she turned back one last time. 250 faces looked at her, some crying, some filming, some applauding, some sitting motionless in shock, and she spoke to all of them in a voice calmer than it had been at any other moment that day. "I'm sorry there's no wedding, but I think you just witnessed something more important. You witnessed a woman choosing herself." Then she turned away and stepped out into the sun. The glossy black Mercedes Maybach was parked right at the church steps, and Kostya had already opened the rear door, standing beside it with perfect posture and a face without expression. Rain helped Amelia into the car first, then Regina, then stepped in last. Monique and Yara stood on the church steps watching them go, Monique lifting a hand in a single wave before turning to Yara and saying something Amelia couldn't hear, though later Monique would tell her that she had said, "That's my girl." Kostya was just closing the door when Brandon came charging out of the church. His hair was no longer slicked neatly back. His suit was wrinkled, his face was flushed, and he ran toward the Maybach with the desperation of a man who had just watched everything he had built collapse in 15 minutes. Kostya didn't stop him with his hands, didn't shove him, didn't touch him. Kostya simply turned to face Brandon and looked at him. Just one look from the eyes of a former Russian operative, eyes that had seen things Brandon Hale couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares, and Brandon stopped 2 steps away from him, as if he had run into an invisible wall. Kostya got into the driver's seat. The car doors closed. The engine started almost without a sound. The Maybach began to roll away from Mulberry Street, and through the rear window Amelia saw Brandon standing alone on the steps of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. His suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled, growing smaller and smaller, until he was nothing but a dark dot against the gray stone, and then he vanished completely when the car turned onto Prince Street. The Maybach turned onto Prince Street, and the noise of the wedding, the applause, the whispering, Brandon calling her name, all of it vanished behind the soundproof glass. Inside the car there was complete silence, the kind of silence Amelia hadn't heard once in the past 5 years, because for 5 years there had always been Brandon's voice, his comments, his corrections, his reminders that she was doing something wrong. Amelia let out a breath. A long, deep breath, from somewhere beneath her breastbone where she hadn't even realized she'd been holding it for so long. Her shoulders dropped, her back settled against the leather seat, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt the simple, almost unbelievable sensation of sitting in a space where no one was judging her. Regina sat to Amelia's left, her hand wrapped tightly around her daughter's, gripping as if she were afraid someone might snatch Amelia away again. But her eyes weren't on her daughter. Her eyes were on Rain Volkov, seated across from them. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had spent 54 years in the South Bronx, who had lost her husband to street violence, who had raised 2 children with her own 2 hands and 2 jobs, and who had learned that no one in this world helped anyone without a reason. She was grateful to this man for what he had just done in the church, but she didn't trust him yet. Didn't trust that a man who rode in a Maybach and frightened lawyers with nothing but a look would walk into a stranger's wedding without wanting something in return. Rain felt that look, but he didn't turn toward her, didn't explain himself, didn't try to persuade her. He only said to Kostya, through the glass partition between the front and back seats, "Mulberry Street, Connie's." The car stopped in front of a small restaurant on Mulberry Street near Canal, one of the last real Italian kitchens left in Little Italy, at a time when most of the neighborhood had become a tourist museum, filled with fake Italian restaurants selling pasta to foreigners. Connie Russo's place didn't have a large sign, only a small hand-painted wooden board hanging on the frosted glass door. Inside were raw red brick walls left unfinished, wooden tables worn down by time and marked with the knife scratches and spoon dents of 40 years of service. The scent of slow-simmered tomato sauce mingling with fried garlic and freshly baked focaccia, the kind of smell no Michelin restaurant could ever recreate, because it took 40 years of standing over a stove for that smell to sink into the walls. Connie Russo, 74 years old, was wiping down a table when the door opened. She saw Rain first, because Rain was a regular, the son of the Italian woman she had once been close to before that woman passed away, and Connie had been cooking for Rain since he was a boy of 12, who had lost his mother in Brighton Beach. But then she saw Amelia step in behind him, wearing an ivory wedding dress torn from shoulder to waist, a gray man's suit jacket draped over her shoulders, her eyes red, her face pale, her hands trembling. Connie lifted a hand to her chest, made the sign of the cross, then stepped forward and wrapped Amelia in an embrace without asking a single question. She held her tightly, the way Italian mothers do when they don't need to know what happened, only that the child standing in front of them is hurting. Then she took the wool shawl she always kept behind the counter, the one she had knitted by hand through the winter, draped it over Amelia's shoulders in place of Rain's jacket, and led her to the quietest corner table in the restaurant. Connie didn't ask what they wanted to eat. She disappeared into the kitchen, and 5 minutes later came back out carrying 3 steaming bowls of minestrone, the kind she made from her mother's recipe in Naples, garden vegetables, white beans, tiny pasta, and broth simmered for 8 hours. She set a bowl in front of each of them, patted Amelia lightly on the shoulder, then went back into the kitchen and closed the door, giving them space. Amelia looked at the bowl of steaming soup. The scent of basil and fresh tomato reached her, and something inside her, the wall she had built over 5 years to keep everything from breaking apart, collapsed. She cried, not softly, not beautifully like in films, but with her whole body, shoulders shaking, hands gripping the edge of the wooden table, tears falling onto the torn lace of her dress, and the sound that came out of her throat was the sound of 5 years bursting loose all at once. She cried because her father had died when she was 14, and there was no one to walk her down the aisle on her wedding day. She cried because her mother had lupus, and she hadn't been allowed to visit her for 2 years. She cried because Tommy, her younger brother, was drowning in gambling debt, and she didn't know how to save him. She cried because she had given up the best job of her life for a man who told her she didn't need to work. She cried because 20 minutes earlier she had almost married a man who saw her as collateral for an $800,000 loan. Regina held her daughter from the left side, saying nothing, simply letting Amelia cry into her shoulder, her hand rubbing slow circles against her back, the same way she had when Amelia was a girl of 14, standing beside her father's coffin. Rain sat to her right. He didn't touch Amelia, didn't say everything would be okay, didn't try to comfort her, didn't do anything except sit there, silent, patient, giving her the space to fall apart without anyone trying to clean up the pieces right away. And that silence, that undemanding presence, was the only right thing anyone could have given Amelia Santos in that moment. Amelia cried until there was nothing left to cry. Her body stopped before her mind did. Her shoulders grew still. Her breathing slowed, and she sat up straight again with swollen red eyes fixed on the bowl of minestrone that had cooled in front of her. She picked up her spoon. Her hand was still trembling slightly, but she dipped the spoon into the soup and took a mouthful. The warm broth slid down her throat, and she felt that warmth spread through her chest as if her body had forgotten what it felt like to be nourished. She ate a few more spoonfuls in silence, then set the spoon down and looked at Rain. He sat across from her, his bowl of minestrone barely touched, both hands resting on the table, his gray eyes on her with the patience of a man who wasn't in any hurry to be anywhere else. "Why did you come?" Amelia asked, and her voice was rough from crying. But the question was clear, direct, without circling around the point. Because Amelia Santos, even after being made smaller for 5 years, was still the woman who had corrected a $200 million contract in front of 15 lawyers, and she didn't ask questions unless she wanted the real answer. Rain looked at her. He was silent for a few seconds, not because he was thinking of what to say, but because he was choosing how much to say. "Because 6 years ago you corrected me in front of my own lawyers," he said, his voice low and steady. "No one does that. Not to me. Not in my own building. You were 21 and you didn't flinch." He paused. "Today, someone was trying to kill that version of you, and I wasn't going to sit in a conference room and watch it happen on a phone screen." He didn't say more. He didn't say that he had known she quit her job 5 years ago. He didn't say that he knew Brandon Hale's name, knew she had moved from a small apartment in the East Village to a penthouse on the Upper East Side, knew she had stopped appearing in legal interpreting circles. He didn't say that 2 years earlier he had paid off Tommy Santos's first gambling debt so the loan sharks wouldn't come looking for her. He kept all of that to himself because Rain Volkov understood that truth had its timing, and now wasn't it. Amelia looked at him for a few more seconds, searching for some sign of a lie, of a hidden motive, of anything that resembled the way Brandon used to say the right words at exactly the right moments to make her believe him. She didn't find anything, but she hadn't found enough to trust him completely either, and she accepted that in-between place, because after 5 years with Brandon, she had learned that trusting too quickly was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Regina had sat in silence through the whole exchange, eating her soup one slow spoonful at a time, but her eyes had never left Rain. Now she set her spoon down, dabbed her mouth with a paper napkin, and looked straight at the man sitting across from her with a look Amelia recognized instantly, because it was the look Regina Santos used whenever she met anyone with more power than she had. Not fear, not deference, only the sharp caution of someone who had spent her whole life at the edge of society and knew that power was never free. "What do you want from my daughter, Mr. Volkov?" The question fell onto the table like a stone dropping into still water. No polite circling, no thanks offered first, just hard and direct. Rain turned and looked at her, and what surprised Amelia was that he didn't seem offended, didn't lift an eyebrow, didn't smile with that patronizing kind of amusement men use when answering an older woman. He looked at Regina with real respect, the kind of respect Amelia guessed he gave to very few people. "Right now? Nothing," he said. "I came because it was the right thing to do. That's all." Regina held his gaze without blinking for 5 long seconds. Then she spoke, her voice low, slow, weighing every word. "I've survived 40 years by knowing which help to accept and which to refuse. I raised 2 children alone in the Bronx, after my husband was shot dead on a Tuesday afternoon. I know what it looks like when a man offers something for free, and I know what it costs later." She paused. "I haven't decided about yours yet, Mr. Volkov." Rain nodded once. He didn't argue, didn't persuade, didn't explain any further. He respected her answer in a way Brandon had never respected any answer that wasn't the one he wanted to hear. They finished their soup in silence. Connie brought out more bread and fresh lemonade without saying a word. When Amelia had finished eating, Rain stood, took his suit jacket from the back of the chair where Amelia had folded it after Connie gave her the wool shawl, and said, "I'll have Kostya drive you both home." He didn't ask for Amelia's address because he already knew it, but that was something he would never admit at this moment. The Maybach stopped in front of Amelia's apartment building in Brooklyn, and Kostya opened the door for mother and daughter. Rain didn't get out, didn't follow them upstairs, didn't say "I'll call you" or make any kind of promise at all. He only said, "Take care, Amelia," through the open car door, and she nodded once, then walked into the building with her mother beside her, her torn dress trailing over the concrete steps, Connie Russo's wool shawl over her shoulders, and for the first time in 5 years, no one followed her up the stairs to check whether she had locked the door. 3 days after the wedding that never happened, the videos from St. Patrick's Old Cathedral exploded across every platform. Not one video, but dozens. Filmed from different angles by guests who couldn't tear their eyes away from their phones, and the internet stitched them together into one complete story that tens of millions of people watched again and again. The title that spread fastest was Mafia Boss Crashes Wedding to Save Bride. And from there the media began to dig. They dug into Rain Volkov's identity, dug into Volkov Holdings, dug into the links between his legal real estate empire and the rumors of an underworld that until now had existed only in whispers within New York's financial circles, but was now being dragged into the glare of flashbulbs from hundreds of news outlets. Reporters parked outside the Volkov Holdings building in Midtown, outside Connie Russo's restaurant on Mulberry Street, and outside Amelia's apartment building in Brooklyn. Amelia didn't leave the apartment. The curtains stayed shut, and her phone was turned off after she received the 200th call from an unknown number on the first day. Regina stayed in her daughter's apartment, sleeping on the sofa, becoming a wall between Amelia and the outside world. She blocked numbers, deleted messages, answered the door when neighbors knocked to ask how she was doing, and turned away every reporter who rang the bell with one sentence only: "No comment. Get off this property before I call the police." But not everything coming from outside was curious reporters. On the second day, an envelope arrived from the law offices of Whitmore and Partners, Douglas Hale's law firm. Inside was a letter threatening to sue Amelia for defamation. The letter stated that Amelia's words, spoken before 250 guests, and millions of people who had since watched the video, had caused serious harm to the professional reputation and personal standing of the Hale family, that Douglas Hale was considering a civil lawsuit seeking damages, and that Amelia should contact legal counsel immediately. Regina read the letter before Amelia did, and she wanted to tear it up, but she didn't, because she knew that when rich people threatened you with stamped paper, it couldn't simply be torn away. She handed it to her daughter, and Amelia read it with trembling hands, not because she was afraid, but because of the helpless fury burning through her, because she had just escaped Brandon, and now his family was trying to force her into silence with money and lawyers, the same method of control in a different form. Then came Tommy. Tommy's call came on the evening of the second day to Regina's phone, because Amelia had turned hers off. Tommy's voice was panicked, fast, broken, the kind of voice Amelia had heard too many times in her life. Her younger brother owed $40,000 to online sports betting apps. Loss piled on loss, loans taken out to win it back only to lose more. And now the people collecting didn't call anymore. They came straight to his door in Queens. Tommy said they had given him 2 weeks. He didn't say 2 weeks for what, because both brother and sister understood. Amelia sat on the sofa in the dark apartment, the curtains drawn shut, her phone off, the letter threatening a lawsuit on the table, Tommy's panicked voice still ringing in her head, and she realized that escaping Brandon didn't mean escaping chaos. She had only traded one kind of chaos for another. 3 days earlier she had almost married the wrong man. Now she was sitting in the dark with a sick mother, a brother in debt, lawyers threatening her, reporters waiting outside her door, and no job, no income, no plan beyond trying to breathe through each day. She was exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes when every direction you look is a wall. On the afternoon of the third day, the apartment buzzer rang. Regina rose from the sofa with the expression of a woman ready to send away yet another reporter. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw Kostya Petrov standing in the hallway with 2 paper bags of food, and behind him was Rain Volkov, in a black shirt, with the top button undone, no suit jacket, looking nothing like the man who had walked into the church 3 days earlier, and yet carrying the same presence that somehow made the 4th-floor hallway of a Brooklyn apartment building feel smaller. Regina opened the door but didn't invite them in right away. She stood in the doorway and looked at Rain for 3 seconds before stepping aside, and Rain understood that those 3 seconds were Regina's way of saying that she was allowing this, but watching closely. Connie Russo had sent food with them: hot lasagna wrapped in foil, focaccia bread, and a small box of tiramisu with a handwritten note in Italian that Amelia would later read and understand as "Mangia, figlia, eat, daughter." Rain set the food on the kitchen table, then sat down in the chair across from Amelia, and Amelia looked at him from the sofa with the eyes of a woman who hadn't slept enough for 3 nights in a row, her hair tied up in a messy knot, wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants. No longer the bride in the church, no longer the sharp interpreter in the glass conference room, just a 27-year-old woman exhausted all the way down to the bone. Rain placed a white envelope on the table. Amelia looked at it without touching it. "Open it," Rain said. Amelia did. Inside were 2 things. The first was a document confirming that Thomas Santos's $40,000 debt had been paid in full, and that no financial obligation remained, complete with signature and seal. The second was a Volkov Holdings business card, with a handwritten note on the back in black ink. Director of International Translations. Position open. No expiration date. Amelia looked at the debt clearance, then at the business card, then at Rain. And what appeared in her eyes wasn't gratitude but anger. The kind of anger that Rain clearly hadn't expected. "I don't take charity," she said, her voice hard, each word another brick in a wall. "I didn't ask you to pay my brother's debt. I didn't ask you for a job. I didn't ask you for anything." Rain didn't look surprised or offended. He sat still, both hands resting on his thighs, looking at her with a patience Amelia didn't understand, because she had never met a powerful man who didn't lose patience when he was refused. "It's not charity," he said. "It's an investment. I invest in people who are worth investing in. You're one of them." Amelia shook her head. "You don't know me. You saw me once 6 years ago in a conference room, and somehow that's enough for you to walk into my wedding, pay my brother's debt, and offer me a job? That's not how the real world works." Rain was silent for a moment, then he spoke again, and his voice dropped lower, so low that Regina, standing in the kitchen, had to step closer to hear. "2 years ago, your brother owed $65,000 to a group operating out of Brighton Beach. They're not the kind of people who send letters. They're the kind of people who show up." Amelia went still. She hadn't known about that debt. Tommy had never told her. "I paid it," Rain continued. "Not because I knew your brother, but because I knew that if they came to collect from him, sooner or later they'd find you, and I wasn't going to let that happen." The apartment went so quiet that Amelia could hear the refrigerator humming. She processed the information 1 layer at a time. Tommy had owed $65,000 2 years ago, and she had never known. Debt collectors from Brighton Beach. Rain had paid it. Rain had known about her before the wedding, before the video, before all of it. "You've been watching me," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been making sure no one else was," Rain answered. Amelia stood. She walked to the door and pulled it open, wide and unmistakable, with no need to explain that she wanted him to leave. "Thank you for the food. Thank you for what you did at the church. Thank you for my brother's debt. But I need you to leave now because I can't think clearly while you're sitting in my apartment telling me you've been involved in my life without my knowledge for 2 years, and I need time to decide whether that makes you different from Brandon or exactly the same." Rain stood without hurry. He nodded once, stepped toward the door, and before Amelia closed it behind him, he said without turning back, "The job offer doesn't expire. Neither does the debt clearance. Whether you ever speak to me again or not, those are done." The door shut. Amelia stood with her back against it, eyes closed, both hands clenched tight. Regina stood in the kitchen watching her daughter and said nothing, because she understood that what Amelia needed right now wasn't advice but space. Night fell. Amelia lay in bed staring at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about Tommy, about the $65,000 from 2 years earlier that she had never known about the debt collectors in Brighton Beach, whose names she didn't know, about the new $40,000 that had now been erased. about the business card on the kitchen table, about Douglas Hale's threatening letter, about the fact that she had no job, no income, no lawyer. She picked up her phone, turned it on, found Rain Volkov's number in her contacts. The number Kostya had left for Regina on the first day in case of emergency. She called. 2 rings. Then he answered, not sounding surprised, or perhaps just very good at hiding surprise. "I'll take the job," Amelia said, her voice calm, clear, with no trace of hesitation. "But I have conditions. I pay my own rent. I choose my own hours. I report to you on work and work only. And if I ever find out that you're making decisions about my life behind my back again, about my brother, about my family, about anything, I walk. No conversation. No second chance. I walk." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then Rain Volkov's voice came through, and Amelia could have sworn she heard something in it that was close to a smile even if he wasn't smiling. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." On the first Monday after that late-night call, Amelia Santos walked into the main lobby of Volkov Holdings, on the ground floor of a 42-story glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. She was wearing a white blouse, black trousers, and flats because she didn't have money to buy new clothes, and this was the only outfit left in her closet that still looked professional after 5 years of wearing only what Brandon chose for her. She crossed the marble lobby, past the reception desk where 2 employees looked at her with open curiosity, because they had watched the church video like the rest of the world, went through security, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. When the elevator doors opened, she saw it immediately. A corner office at the end of the hall, glass door, and on that door a small metal plaque engraved with her name, Amelia Santos, Director of International Translations. It wasn't the kind of temporary sign someone could print overnight. It had been etched into metal, fastened to the frame with screws, the kind of plaque that had to be ordered at least a week in advance, which meant Rain had this nameplate made before she agreed to take the job, maybe the moment he slipped that business card into the envelope, maybe even earlier. Amelia stood in front of that door for 30 seconds with a storm of emotions moving through her. Part of her touched that someone believed in her enough to prepare a place for her before she ever arrived. Part of her uneasy, because Rain's certainty felt dangerously close to the way Brandon had once arranged her life, without asking permission. But she walked in. She walked in and found a room with windows facing Central Park, an oak desk, a leather chair, a computer, and a cup of coffee still steaming on the desk, placed there by someone she didn't know. Over the next 3 months, Amelia proved that the plaque on that door wasn't favoritism. It was truth. In the 3rd week, she spotted a translation error in the Italian version of a contract with a real estate partner in Milan, a mistake the internal legal team had missed. And if it hadn't been corrected, Volkov Holdings would have lost its right of first refusal in a $70 million deal. In the 2nd month, she closed her first deal, an interpreting and legal consulting contract for a resort project on the Amalfi Coast. And she closed it not because Rain cleared the path for her, but because she called the Italian partner directly in Italian, negotiated in Italian, and signed in Italian. And when the call ended, the partner on the other side told his assistant that it was the first time in 20 years of working with an American company that they had felt respected in their own language. In the 3rd month, she closed a 2nd deal in Barcelona and began getting invited into senior meetings, not as an interpreter, but as an advisor. Throughout those 3 months, the relationship between Amelia and Rain didn't grow through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through small details Amelia only began to notice over time. Every morning when she arrived at the office, there was already a hot cup of coffee on her desk, a strong espresso with a little oat milk, exactly the way she drank it even though she had never told anyone. She didn't know whether Rain brought it himself or had someone do it, but the coffee appeared every day, even on the days he wasn't in the office, even on the days she arrived late, as if someone always knew she was coming and had prepared for her. One night she worked late until nearly 11, lifted her eyes from the screen, and looked through the glass wall of her office into the dark hallway, and there he was, Rain standing at the far end of the corridor looking toward her. He didn't walk in, didn't knock, didn't ask why she was working so late. When their eyes met across 20 yards of glass in silence, he nodded once and turned away, and Amelia sat there with her heartbeat suddenly faster than she wanted to admit. In the 6th week, a black sedan, with plates she couldn't make out, followed Amelia from the subway station all the way to her apartment building in Brooklyn. She noticed because the car made every turn she made and parked 3 buildings away when she went inside. She texted Rain and said only that an unfamiliar car had followed her. 10 minutes later, 3 black SUVs were parked outside her building. Kostya stepped out of the first one, and the strange sedan disappeared from the street without anyone needing to say a word. The next morning, Rain stepped into Amelia's office for the first time since she had started working there. He stood in the doorway, didn't sit, didn't come all the way in, and said 4 words, "It won't happen again." Then he left. Amelia sat there staring at the closed door and realized something that took her a long time to accept. Rain Volkov had power. More power than Brandon by 100 times over, but he didn't use it to control her. He didn't tell her what to do, didn't make decisions for her, didn't arrange her life according to his will. In meetings, he asked for her opinion in front of 14 powerful men, then listened to her answer and acted on it. When she proposed changing the approach to European partners, he didn't dismiss her. He said, "Do it your way," and gave her full authority. When she failed, when the small deal in Lisbon fell apart, he didn't criticize her. He asked, "What did you learn?" and moved her on to the next project. For the first time in her life, Amelia Santos was experiencing something she had never believed was real. Power that could exist without shrinking anyone. Strength that could exist without making someone else weaker. And the strongest man she had ever known was the only one who had never once asked her to become smaller. In the 4th month, Tommy called. Not Amelia, but Regina, at 2 o'clock in the morning, his voice shaking and fast. The kind of voice both mother and daughter recognized instantly, because they had heard it too many times before. Tommy had lost again. This time it wasn't an online sports betting app, but an underground poker room in Queens, the kind hidden behind a laundromat on Roosevelt Avenue. No sign outside, but inside 6 card tables, security cameras, and men who didn't wear name tags. Tommy had been playing there every night for 6 weeks, borrowing to win it back, winning it back to lose it again, losing to borrow more, the same old spiral with new money, and now he owed $120,000. Regina didn't tell Amelia right away. She kept it from her for 2 days because she wanted to protect her daughter from the next blow. But on the 3rd day, Tommy called Amelia directly at the office at 3 in the afternoon, crying, apologizing, begging, and Amelia heard her brother's voice through the phone, and her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She set the phone down, both hands gripping the edge of the oak desk, staring out the window toward Central Park, without seeing anything but a pale white blur, because her vision had gone soft with tears. She had tried. She had done everything right. She had taken the job, proved herself, begun rebuilding her life from the wreckage, and now Tommy was dragging her back under with $120,000 from an underground poker room in Queens, and she didn't know how many times she could save him, before admitting that there were people she loved, whom she simply couldn't save. She cried, not the raw sobbing she had done in Connie's restaurant, but silent tears, slipping down her cheeks and falling onto the computer keyboard, her shoulders trembling slightly, no sound at all, because after 5 years with Brandon, she had learned how to hide pain in public places. She didn't hear the office door open. She didn't know how long Rain had been standing in the doorway before he stepped inside. She only knew that when she looked up, he was already seated in the chair across from her desk, silent, not asking, not speaking, just there. It was the first time Rain Volkov had sat down in her office since she started working there. For 4 months, he had remained standing in the doorway. For 4 months he had kept the physical distance. Amelia slowly came to understand was his way of respecting the boundaries she had set during that late-night phone call. And now he sat because he could see this wasn't a moment for standing at the threshold. "Tommy?" he asked, a single word, Amelia nodded, not trusting her voice enough to speak. How much? 120,000. Underground poker room in Queens. Rain was silent. He didn't look surprised, because Amelia suspected he already knew that his network was wide enough that an underground poker room in Queens couldn't operate without him hearing about it. Then he spoke, and this time his voice was different. Not the voice of a boss speaking to an employee or a patron speaking to someone under his protection, but the voice of a man choosing to tell the truth even though he knew it might change everything. Amelia, I need to tell you something. She looked at him. I've known about you for 6 years, not just from the conference room. After that meeting, I asked my people to find out who you were. I knew when you left your job. I knew when you moved in with Brandon Hale. I knew when you stopped working, stopped translating, stopped appearing at industry events. I watched your career disappear and I told myself it wasn't my business. He paused, but I also told myself that if you ever needed help, I'd be there. Not because you owed me anything. Because that day in the conference room you showed me something I don't see very often. Courage. And I wasn't going to let the world lose that. Amelia wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. The pain about Tommy was still there, but now it was tangled with something else. Shock, anger, and a feeling she couldn't name. Am I a project to you? She asked, and her voice was sharp even though it was still wet with tears. Is that what this is? I saw something broken 6 years ago and you've been waiting to fix it? Rain stood. He walked to the window overlooking Central Park, his back to her, and Amelia saw the slight tension in his shoulders, the first small sign that her question had struck something he didn't have a polished answer for. Not a project, he said, his voice low, as he looked out at the trees of Central Park, beginning to turn with autumn. A promise I made to myself. He didn't turn around. Amelia looked at his back, straight beneath the black shirt, broad shoulders, head slightly bowed as if he had just said something he wasn't used to saying, and in the silence between them, she felt a shift, gentle as the turn of a compass needle. Something changing from gratitude into something else. Deeper, more dangerous, something she wasn't ready to name yet but couldn't pretend not to feel. 6 months after the day Amelia walked into Volkov Holdings, she was formally appointed Director of International Operations. She had closed 5 European deals, built a legal translation team of 7 people, and become the first person foreign partners called when they wanted to work with Volkov Holdings. On the same day the promotion announcement went out company-wide, Kostya Petrov was standing in the hallway speaking with a security guard, and when Amelia passed by with a cup of coffee in her hand and nodded hello to Kostya, the former operative, the quietest bodyguard in the building, watched her go, then turned to his colleague and said softly, in a voice that was almost surprised, "She's the only person I've seen him smile at in 6 years." 4 months after the wedding that never happened, the email arrived. It didn't come from Brandon, but from a new lawyer's address. Not Whitmore and Partners, Douglas's firm, but a much smaller law office in Midtown whose name Amelia had never heard before. And that alone said a great deal, because it meant Douglas Hale had stopped paying legal fees for his son. The email demanded that Amelia sign a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, promising never to speak publicly about Brandon Hale, about the wedding, about what happened in the church, about what she had said in front of 250 people. And in exchange, the Hale family would withdraw their threat of a defamation lawsuit. Amelia read the email, then deleted it without replying. 2 weeks later, Brandon Hale appeared in the ground floor lobby of Volkov Holdings. He didn't make an appointment, didn't call ahead. He simply walked in and told reception that he needed to see Amelia Santos immediately. The receptionist called up to the 42nd floor, and Amelia could have said no, could have asked security to escort him out, but she didn't. She told them to send him up, because she understood that some chapters had to be closed in person, not through emails and lawyers. Brandon stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor, and for a moment Amelia almost didn't recognize him. 4 months had taken a great deal from Brandon Hale. He was thinner, the shadows under his eyes were dark and deep, stubble covered his face in uneven patches, His suit was wrinkled and no longer Tom Ford but something far cheaper, and the shoes that had once been polished to perfection were now worn down at the heels. The investment fund had fired him 2 weeks after the wedding, when the video spread and the partners pulled their money. The $800,000 of debt now had no one left to underwrite it, because the image of stability he had needed from the wedding had collapsed live on a live stream. Douglas had separated from Petra, blaming Brandon for destroying in one afternoon the family reputation he had spent 30 years building, and Petra had moved into her sister's apartment in Connecticut. The Hale family had fallen apart like a building with its foundation ripped away. Amelia led Brandon into a small conference room, not her office because she didn't want him stepping into the space she had built, and sat across from him at the glass table. Brandon looked around the room, at the glass walls, at the view of Manhattan, at the Volkov Holdings logo on the door, then back at Amelia in her clean, composed business clothes with bright eyes and a straight back, nothing like the woman he had spent 5 years shrinking into a version he could tolerate, and something in his face cracked. "So you're his woman now?" Brandon said, and his voice was bitter but thin, much thinner than it had been 4 months earlier, the voice of a man who had lost too much to keep enough strength for cruelty. Amelia looked at him. She looked at the man she had once loved, once believed she would spend her life with, once allowed to reduce her into a shape he could manage, and she didn't feel anger. She felt something closer to pity, though not entirely pity, because pity implied looking down, and Amelia wasn't looking down at Brandon. She was looking straight at him. "I'm my own," she said. "That's something you never understood." Brandon lowered his head. His hands rested on the glass table, his fingers trembling slightly. Then he lifted his face again, and in his eyes Amelia saw something she hadn't expected. Not remorse, but desperation. The kind of desperation that belongs to an animal cornered hard enough that it is ready to bite anyone who comes near. "I know what he is," Brandon said, his voice low and fast. "Volkov. I know what his family does. The money, the connections, the things that don't show up on tax returns. If you don't sign that NDA, I'll go to the FBI. I'll give them everything I know." Amelia hadn't even opened her mouth before the conference room door swung open. No one knocked first. Rain Volkov walked in with the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to the elbows and those gray eyes. Amelia had spent 6 months learning how to read, and what she read in them now made her stop breathing. Not anger, something deeper than anger, controlled danger, the kind of calm Kostya had once described to her by saying, "When he's quiet, everyone should be afraid." Rain walked straight toward Brandon. He stopped less than a step away, half a head taller, and looked down at him with the kind of gaze Amelia was certain had made men far more dangerous than Brandon Hale step backward. Silence stretched for 10 seconds. 10 seconds in which Brandon didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't blink. 10 seconds in which he understood, through the oldest instinct of survival, that the man standing in front of him didn't threaten with words, because he had no need for words. Then Rain spoke, low and slow, each word another door closing. "Walk out of this building. Never contact her again. Never mention my name to anyone. And in return I will forget that you exist. That is the most generous offer you will ever receive. Take it." Brandon looked at Rain, looked at Amelia, looked back at Rain. Then he stood, shoved his chair back without saying another word, and walked out of the conference room with the slumped shoulders of a man who had lost everything, and knew it. The door closed. Brandon's footsteps faded down the hallway, then disappeared completely when the elevator door shut. Only 2 people remained in the room. Amelia looked at Rain. He was still standing where he had been, his eyes fixed on the direction Brandon had gone, his jaw still clenched, his breathing steady but deeper than usual, and Amelia knew that what he had just said to Brandon hadn't been an empty threat. "Are you going to hurt him?" she asked. Rain turned to look at her. Gray eyes met brown ones across the glass table, and in that moment, Amelia saw something she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see: complete honesty, with no layer over it. "Do you want me to?" he asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. He was asking her for real. He was placing that decision in her hands. A decision that for a man like Rain Volkov would require only a single word. No, Emilia said. Then no, Rain answered, and he walked out of the room. Emilia remained alone in the glass conference room overlooking Manhattan, and she understood something that would take her a very long time to fully grasp. The most powerful man she had ever known, the man New York feared, the man who controlled an empire stretching from Midtown to Brighton Beach, had just placed a decision in her hands and accepted her answer without asking twice. Brandon had spent 5 years trying to control every decision she made. Rain had just given her control over one of his, and that difference said everything words could never fully hold. 1 year after the day the wedding never happened, on Emilia Santos's 28th birthday, Connie Russo's small restaurant on Mulberry Street closed early to outside customers and opened its doors for the only 6 people who mattered. Connie had been cooking since morning, minestrone from the Naples recipe she had made for Emilia 1 year earlier when she walked into the restaurant in a torn dress. And today, she made it again not out of sadness, but because it had become the dish that marked a beginning. Regina arrived first, carrying the birthday cake she had baked herself in her small kitchen in the Bronx. A tres leches cake from Emilia's grandmother's recipe in Puerto Rico, smooth white frosting spread across the top. 28 small candles set in a circle. She placed the cake on the worn wooden table, then sat down with hands that still ached from lupus, but eyes much brighter than they had been a year earlier, because over the past year she had been allowed back into her daughter's life, had gotten nightly phone calls, had been picked up from the Bronx and driven down to Brooklyn every weekend. All the small things Brandon had taken away and that had now returned. Monique Torres and Yara Ose arrived together. Monique carrying a cheap bottle of Prosecco, because she said expensive wine was for people who didn't know how to enjoy themselves. Yara bringing a small bouquet of flowers and arranging it in a glass jar in the center of the table. Then Tommy walked in. Emilia looked at her brother, and it took her a few seconds to adjust to the sight of him because Tommy looked different. Not different because of new clothes or a neat haircut, but different in his eyes, because Tommy's eyes no longer held the evasive, ashamed, panicked look she had seen in him for so many years. Tommy now worked as a prep cook at an Italian restaurant in the Volkov Holdings chain in Lower Manhattan, a position Rain had arranged quietly, with a salary enough to live on, steady hours, and most important of all, people around him who kept him from slipping back into the old cycle. Tommy went to Gamblers Anonymous every Tuesday and Thursday, had cleared his debts, and hadn't touched cards or placed a bet in 8 months. He hugged his sister longer than usual and said nothing, because both of them knew that apologies had already been said enough times, and now it was time to prove things through actions. The last person to arrive was Rain. He brought a bottle of red wine, a 20-year-old Barolo, and set it on the table beside Monique's cheap Prosecco, and somehow the contrast between those 2 bottles captured everything about the group gathered in that room. Entirely different people sitting at the same table, because they all loved one woman. Connie carried out the minestrone, 6 bowls, steam rising in the warm yellow light. Everyone took a seat around the worn wooden table, where 40 years of customers had sat before them, and Regina lifted her glass. 1 year, she said, her voice steadier than Emilia had ever heard it in her life, since my daughter chose herself. Glasses touched. Monique took a sip of Prosecco, then said with the smile only Monique could wear, a smile both defiant and tender, and scared the hell out of 250 rich people doing it. The whole table laughed, even Rain, and Emilia saw that smile on his face. Rare, brief, but real, and she remembered what Kostya had said. The only person I've seen him smile at in 6 years. Emilia looked around the table. Her mother, her brother, her 2 closest friends, the 74-year-old woman carrying soup from the kitchen, and the man sitting across from her pouring Barolo into Regina's glass with more care than she had ever seen him give any multi-million-dollar contract. "A year ago," Emilia said, "I thought my life was over. 27, no job, no money, no plan, sitting in a dark apartment with a torn wedding dress on the floor. And now..." She paused and looked at each face. "Now I have work I'm proud of. I have freedom I earned. I have every single one of you, and I have myself back." She told them about the dress. It was still there, no longer crumpled on the floor of a dark apartment, but preserved in a glass case hanging in the living room of her new Brooklyn apartment, paid for with her own salary, not in the offices of Volkov Holdings, not anywhere that belonged to anyone else, but in her home, the place she decided. "The dress was damaged," Amelia said, "but we don't have to be defined by what happens to us. We can be defined by what we do after." Connie passed by the table, heard her, and set down an extra stack of napkins without saying a word, because she knew everyone sitting at that table was going to need them. Dinner ended when Connie began clearing the table and shooing everyone out with her usual line, "Go home. I need to sleep. You people eat too much." Monique and Yara hugged Amelia on the sidewalk of Mulberry Street, then caught a taxi back to Harlem. Tommy hugged his sister one more time, then walked toward the subway with the steady steps of a man learning how to live one day at a time. Regina held her daughter the longest, whispered something in Spanish into Amelia's ear that only the two of them could hear, then got into the taxi. Rain had already called to take her back to the Bronx. That left two people standing on the sidewalk. The Maybach was parked a few yards away. Kostya had already gone home, and tonight Rain was driving himself. He opened the passenger door for Amelia, not in some theatrical way, but with the natural ease of a man who had done that for her all year, without ever turning it into something bigger than it was. Amelia got into the car, Rain walked around to the driver's side, and the Maybach pulled away from Mulberry Street toward Brooklyn by way of the Manhattan Bridge. They didn't talk on the drive. The city moved past outside the window, the lights of Manhattan growing smaller behind them, the Manhattan Bridge shining beneath them, then Brooklyn opening ahead with its rows of brownstones and yellow streetlights. Amelia looked out the window, without really seeing anything, because she was thinking about the past year, about the man sitting an arm's length away with his hands on the wheel, about everything he had done, and everything he had not done. And sometimes what a person does not do says more than what they do. The car stopped in front of Amelia's apartment building in Brooklyn. The engine kept running softly. A yellow streetlight washed over half of Rain's face through the glass, half light and half shadow. And Amelia thought that suited him better than any other kind of light ever could, because Rain Volkov had always existed on the border between two worlds. The silence stretched. Not an awkward silence, but the kind that belongs to two people who have spent enough time together that they don't need to fill every empty space with words. Then Amelia spoke. "You never asked me for anything." Her voice was soft, but clear in the quiet of the car. "In 1 year, you gave me a job. You protected my brother. You stood in a church for me. You sat with me while I cried. You let me yell at you. You let me set every rule. And you never once asked me for anything in return." Rain didn't turn to look at her. His hands stayed on the wheel, his eyes fixed through the windshield on the quiet Brooklyn street. And when he answered, his voice was lower than usual, the kind of low she only heard when he was saying something that truly mattered. "Because the last man who had you asked for everything. He asked you to give up your career, your language, your mother, your voice. He asked you to become smaller every single day until there was almost nothing left." He paused. His finger tapped the wheel once, the only small habit Amelia had come to recognize as a sign that he was searching for the exact right words. "I wanted to be different from that. I wanted to be the one who gave you the choice to give nothing or everything, on your terms, not mine." Amelia looked at him, at the lit side of his face and the dark side, at the faint scar along his jaw, at the gray eyes staring straight ahead, while she knew he was using all his discipline not to turn toward her. Because if he turned toward her now, the distance he had kept for a year would narrow, and he didn't want to narrow it unless she allowed him to. She opened the car door, put one foot down onto the sidewalk, then stopped, turned back, bent slightly, and looked into the car through the open door. And for the first time in a year she looked straight into Rain Volkov's eyes without searching for hidden motives, without guarding herself, without comparing him to Brandon, simply looking at him. "Good night, Rain," she said, and those two words carried something more than a farewell. They carried the promise that there would be more evenings, more conversations, more comfortable silences in the car. And both of them heard that promise, even though neither said it aloud. "Good night, Amelia," Rain answered, and she could have sworn the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not a smile, only the shadow of one. But from Rain Volkov that was already a great deal. Amelia closed the car door, went into the building, climbed 4 flights of stairs, unlocked the apartment she paid for with her own salary, switched on the living room light, and stood there looking at the wedding dress preserved in a glass case on the wall. The tier from shoulder to waist was still there, the ivory chantilly lace still ripped open, 6 months of secret saving and $28,000 of dreams ruined in 3 seconds. But it was beautiful. Beautiful because it was real. Because it was proof that she had stood up, had walked away, had said no. On the table beside her bed, the Volkov Holdings business card was still there. The first one Rain had slipped into the envelope the day he came to her apartment. The back marked with the handwritten words, Director of International Translations. Position open. No expiration date. She had kept it from the first day. The dress was torn, but she was whole. More whole than she had been at any point in the past 5 years. And outside the 4th floor window, New York City was still alive, still breathing, still moving, and she was part of it. Down on the street, the black Maybach still hadn't pulled away. Rain Volkov sat behind the wheel with the engine off, his hands still resting on the steering wheel, his eyes lifted toward the 4th floor window that had just come to life. He sat there for 3 minutes. 3 minutes in which the man who controlled an empire stretching from Midtown Manhattan to Brighton Beach, the man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and feared behind closed doors, sat alone in the dark looking up at one lit window in Brooklyn, and wondered whether the most dangerous thing he had ever done in his life wasn't the multi-million-dollar deals, wasn't the confrontations with enemies, wasn't any of the things the outside world feared him for, but allowing himself to care about a woman in a torn dress who had looked him in the eye 6 years earlier and told him he was wrong. 3 minutes later, he started the engine, and the Maybach slipped quietly away from the Brooklyn street into the current of New York's nightlights. Amelia Santos's story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no prince on a white horse, no magic, no perfectly packaged ending. There was a woman pushed to the bottom who stood up on her own. There was a mother who stayed silent for 40 years, and then spoke at the exact moment her daughter needed her most. There was a dangerous man who chose to use power to lift someone up instead of press someone down. And there was a torn dress hanging on the wall of a Brooklyn apartment, reminding anyone who looked at it that dignity is never destroyed by someone else unless we allow it to be. The lesson was simple, but many people spend a lifetime learning it. Real love never asks you to become smaller. Real power doesn't need to control anyone. And it is never too late to choose yourself. If this story touched something inside you, write one word only in the comments. Freedom. So I'll know you're here and that you heard it. If this story made you think of someone, a friend, a sister, a mother, or even your own self from years ago, press share so this story can reach the person who most needs to hear it. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to more stories that reach straight into the heart. I want to hear from you. Which part of the story moved you most? The moment the dress was torn, the moment Amelia walked down the aisle, or the moment Rain placed his jacket over her shoulders without saying a word? And in your real life, have you ever had to choose yourself even when it meant walking away from what was familiar? Share it with me in the comments, because every one of your stories matters, and I read every line from the depths of my heart. Thank you for being here today. I wish you and the people you love good health, a joyful life, and peace in every passing day. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.